Well, it's physical, psychological, spiritual, and emotional enslavement. And so we have been traumatized, and trauma has an effect upon the mind, the body, and the spirit. And so when they talk about post-traumatic, it's like almost post-traumatic stress disorder. People still have the remnants of being traumatized. And for us, for Africans in the Americas, North and South America, and maybe throughout the entire diaspora, we have been victimized to the degree that many of us want to deny it and abandon it, which is a defense mechanism of post-traumatic slavery stress disorder, in that we oftentimes are unable to manage it. And so when we're unable to manage it, we take the position of putting it somewhere else, denying that it ever happened, and wanting to move on. But you can't move on because the remnants of the victimization have been passed on from generation to generation. We have intergenerational trauma. And so some of the ways that we have learned to cope has been passed on from that time to this time, and will go into some other time, because we've never been without trauma. Part of the problem is that it's not really post for us. Is still present for us. And we're experiencing complex compound trauma, where we're being traumatized up on top of the trauma, up on top of the trauma.
Tell us about what examples of that trauma that impacts our daily lives. People want to know what do we see?
Well, the language we use, some of us don't even like to be called African. I don't know how much trauma you can get when you're denying who you really are. And some of us begin to look at each other as though we're the enemy, rather than we're kith and kin. Many of us live in impoverished conditions, have inadequate nutrition, have schools that are not fit for humans to be involved in, and deal in situations that that defy our humanity, and have a system that has been created from the time we got off that boat to the present time, where our humanity is consistently being denied and determined by others who don't have any respect for us as human beings, who still consider us as property.
So let's look at it from the perspective of parenting. How does post-traumatic slave disorder or this disorder impact us, examples in parents to child relationships?
Well, I think, there's a lot of ways that it impacts, but one of the ways that it impacts is that it creates fear. And it creates fear that passed on to your children, so that many children are not socialized into being assertive and into being aggressive in the context of not negativity, but in the context of going out and getting what you want, going out and being able to compete because they're being constantly bombarded with you're less than, or when they do better than, denying the right to be able to express themselves, or denying the right to be able to show their excellence and their creativity. So that's one area. The other area is that the myths that we tell our children. What do I mean by that? Sometimes we tell our children that they don't have the right to exercise their human rights because in our society we've created a situation where we kill black children who act like children. We kill them, we shoot them, and as I had alluded to in previous discussions, that we also think of children that are of African descent as being older than what they really are. I mean, there have been studies that have shown that say, for example, at the University of California, they did a screen test with students who were white students looking at pictures of children, and each child was the same age, but when they got to the black child was always considered older. And as a result of that, our children are being held responsible for things that other children are able to get away with because they're children, for God's sake. And so we have taught our children to be fearful. I'm not saying it's not justified, but it's part of the conditioning process of the post-traumatic enslavement disorder, because we know that if they are children and act like normal children, because they are African descent and the color of their skin is likely to get them killed.
Just thinking about that parent who's on the other side and thinking, am I perpetuating this? What can I do? What can I do to stop doing something that might be remnant from slavery?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that it exists. You can't control or compete or defeat anything that you don't recognize. And many of us are not aware that we may be impacting our children and their normal growth and development by virtue of our own fear, which is not, like I said, unjustified, but at the same time, it is stunting the growth and creativity of our children. What is important is to first acknowledge it. Secondly, to have a good support system through your community, your church, your social organization, and maybe your family, that will nourish and protect and insulate our young people as well as ourselves, so that when we're having problems, we have some place we can go. Back in the day, there was something called the Council of Elders. And in communities, I think there's a need for us to reactivate these Council of Elders. Some of our things don't have to go to the police department. Some of our things don't have to be dealt with in the court systems. They can be dealt with through a council of elders that people respect and select within each community and within each neighborhood, so that we can begin to resolve some of these lesser issues within our own bodies of knowledge and within our own wisdom, circles. Back in the day, there was no African word for jail, because it didn't exist. And so now what we've bought into the myth of the European system of dealing with problems, and when in the past we would manage our own. And I'm not talking about violent crimes and things of this nature. I'm talking about the regular run-of-the-mill stuff that is consistent with American history, that we could deal with our own council of elders, and that we could address and simply resolve without having to have it go to be something that's all out of proportion, disproportionate, costing lots of money, and creating more confusion and hard feelings within our community. And then that would begin to show our children how we can do conflict resolution without violence.
Now, in relation to that conflict resolution, let's talk about our relationships, particularly actions with one another. How does post-traumatic slave interact even with how we relate to one another, male or female, or just even within amongst ourselves?
Well, the issue is what we learned from the enslavement experience is that we don't count. And I don't have to respect you because you don't count. And we then don't see ourselves in anybody else. We don't see a connection with every other African person. Who you are and what you do are not the same. We are all people of African descent. Some of us act and behave in ways that are not appropriate. Others behave appropriately. But one of the things that is critical for us is to be kinder and gentler and more loving to each other, and not tolerate behaviors that are not appropriate, but at the same time be forgiving so that people can learn from their mistakes.
This being, as we're looking at 400 years from the time some of our ancestors came across enslaved, how much progress would you say we've made over the past 400 years from the emancipation of us physical slavery till now?
Well, we still have mental slavery and some level of physical slavery. We've done very well in many ways, and there's a lot that we still need to do. I don't think we should be totally critical because we're still living. And as I allude to all the time, we're not dead yet. And despite all the adversity of situations and circumstances and people attempting to take us off the face of this earth, we are still here. So we have come a long way. We've got people who have graduated school, educated, gotten degrees and working in powerful positions. But at the same time, in that context, some of us have forgotten from whence we come. And some of us do not think they need the support of African people anymore if they are supported by Europeans. Somehow they define themselves by their oppressor, and that in many ways is problematic because it creates a schism within our communities that is hard to mend. But we have done, considering the circumstances, well in one sense, and we still got a long way to go in another sense. In other words, the fight's not done.
Exactly. And you talk about the impact. I mean, I think a couple of people a few maybe weeks ago, we were introduced to a young lady named Treasure from one of these shows, and she identified as being white,
Yes.
even though she is physically black. And you ask yourself, what must have happened in this child's home that she got so disconnected from her identity that she totally identifies with another group other than accept her own identity as a young lady of African ancestry?
Well, I have a number of thoughts about that. First of all, one is attention seeking. Let me just say that. I think you get a lot of attention when you're blacker than 150 million midnights and you call yourself white. I do think that. The second thing is I think what she is reflecting is the kind of negativity that we have about ourselves. I have some relatives and friends that never speak well about black people in their home. And so when their children come in with white girlfriends or boyfriends or spouses, they want to know what happened. Well, what happened is that you constantly, badgered down or beat down your own kind. And so you send a message to a child that, you don't want to be like this. So some of it is that. The other part of it is the media and what the perceptions are and what the information that is being garnered by this young lady from the media that makes her, say that. And then the final thing, she could be crazy.
Also, in terms of our youth, as we've talked about the fact that unfortunately a disproportionate number of young people, male as well as female, are being caught up in the prison pipeline.
Right.
In terms of the activities that provide a excuse for individual municipalities to decide to put a young man and young woman in incarceration, and how we can somehow support our young people not to go or do activities that can lead to these types of circumstances.
Well, the streets claim a lot of our young people because our young people have few alternatives. Many of them are looking to get the new God, which is money. And so they will do the things that they see that make them money because their opportunities are limited. And as I say, there may not be sufficient employment opportunities, and we as a people have not created sufficient employment opportunities to make these children, feel like that they have a place within our communities. Secondly, there's a lot of media and a lot of propaganda that goes out that makes young people think that this is a glamorous life because they see the bling bling, they see the cars, they see the women, they see all of these accoutrements that have no significance and meaning to the quality of anybody's life. And so as a result of that, they're like young people, they're drawn to that, and we've not developed a counter offensive for that. We're still using old methods of telling people, don't do this, don't do that. And children are not hearing that because we do not live as we tell them to live. We are inconsistent with our own behaviors, and our children see us, and they emulate us, and they imitate us. I think it's critical that we, in order to save our children from the school-to-prison pipeline, is that we become greater advocates for our children from the time they are conceived in utero, and that we create and stimulate them in utero. And then when they come out, bless them as being a part of a family as well as a community. People feel disenfranchised. Back in the day, if you did something wrong, 24 people got to you before you got home. and mama got you last, and daddy might have been after that. And so we, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. It does. And we have lost village. And as a result of that, we are losing our children. So the inconsistencies in our lives, the do as we say but not as we do mentality, the lack of creating viable and meaning experiences for our children. And one of the things that we do know, that children who are raised with African children who are raised with an African-centered knowledge tend to not be in the juvenile justice system. There are less of them in the juvenile justice system than those who attend the regular school. I think we need the regular school, but we need the after school, and we need the Saturday school, where we are actually training our young people in their history, in their culture, in their manhood, in their womanhood. And I don't think we would see these children going to prison. And that would be an interesting economic downturn for certain groups of people, wouldn't it?
Well, you know, you've shared a lot for food for thought, and certainly the whole question of now looking at where do we go from here, what do we do now after 400 years of our sojourn, how do we make the next 400 years more successful, where we're all kind of moving in the direction where we say, what would you say we would need to do at this point?
The first thing we have to do is develop a love affair with ourselves. We have to begin to love ourselves. I can't love you and respect you if I don't love me and respect me. We have to get rid of the propaganda, the fake news that really tells us that we're something other than who we are. And we have to inculcate that into the concept of our everyday life. Not just say it, but live it. It means that we have to have a sense of community. We have to have a sense of love and respect for each other. The slavery period taught us to hate each other, taught us to hate ourselves. So these next 400 years, as they say in the book 2000 Season, are the 400 years for us to decide to rediscover who we are, rediscover the fact that we came from greatness, and that greatness is what our destiny is to continue to be, and that we stop following every little nook and cranny and every kind of little fad that comes out, because we love to be on top of everything. So we need to begin to look at how we can develop and insulate and protect our children and make sure that they're not exposed to things that children should not be exposed to until they're age appropriate. And we need to call to question any person of African descent that is caught up in doing the business of our enemies, and that we need to hold them responsible. We need to call them out. We need to make sure that the community knows who they are, and we need to stop putting them in political offices, and we need to stop putting them in heads of corporations, and we need to understand that we don't control all the money. We never will control all the money. Most of America, white, black, blue, or green, don't control all the money. But we have to begin to consolidate and pool our resources so that we can empower our communities to do the things that we can do to help us grow, glow, and become more manifest for what we were put on this earth to do.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much. And for those out there, and, you know, for those out there who would like to connect to you, how can they reach you?
Well, I can be reached at on Doc Pat Newton, DOCPATNEWTON @gmail.com. And I can be reached at 410-752-2943. That's 410-752-2943, and DocPatNewton @gmail.com.
Well, you know, I want to say, Dr. Newton, and I'm going to use your traditional name, Nana. I really, really thank you so much for joining us. I think that you provided our audience with a lot of food for thought, and certainly we really want to commend the work you've done, and particularly in the traditions of the great Frances Cress Welsing, and I can't by any means not have you speak about her before you leave, just to talk to our audience briefly about who she was and her impact on your life.
Well, she was a major psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, and an adult psychiatrist. Worked initially at Howard University. I met her was I was still a medical student, and went to see her. She spent time with me. She didn't even really know me, and at the end of that session, I was getting ready to leave, and I was about to begin my internship in a few months, and she said, "Well, I know we're going to see you in psychiatry, my dear." I said, "Oh no, I'm going to be a surgeon." "Oh no, my dear, you're a thinker, not a cutter," and the rest is history.
Yes, yes, and definitely it is, and certainly when we think about the work that she's laid down and the work that you continue to do, and we certainly thank you, and we look forward to having you back.
Look forward to coming back. Thank
But
you.
until next time, I just want to say, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you. Let's welcome Joe Patan.
They jumping in the city, West Indian happy, happy whole time for Labor Day. I tell you, no problem, for we take over Harlem Sunday, eve of Labor Day. Virgin Islands crew in town, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. When you hear the cowbell ring, Harlem will be jumping. Hey, hey, Carnival, hey, hey, Bacchanal, hey, hey, Carnival, oh yeah. Virgin Islands in town for Labor Day. The action will be heavy. People from the
I realized that to learn about the people, you study the dance. And when you study the dance, you learn the history of the people, because dance in traditional African cultures used to preserve, and so that the young coming forth learn by age group. And as I said, I'm skipping years. In traditional African cultures, you learn by age group. So you would have the toddlers who will be going around, they aren't paying any attention, but they are, because these rhythms are becoming a part. And then as they go into the initiation rites, everything is explained. Then after the initiation, then they are ready for courtship and marriage, and then maybe baby naming ceremonies, and on and up until they make the transition to the grand ancestor.